Good evening, everybody, and Happy New Year to you all. Great to see such a fabulous turnout. For those that don't know me, I'm Pamela Nathan, SAJAC's president. So it's 2021, and what a challenging time we're living through. Last year, in January, the AGM was held at Hilary and Selwyn Issako's beautiful home. We served a scrumptious poke meal catered by Sweetnetfin, and Dr. David Klein, SDSU's history professor, was our guest speaker. And he enlightened us about the fascinating oral history project that he had begun on the South African Jews who have emigrated to San Diego and Southern California. Now, here we are. It's 12 months later. Our only option is a Zoom meeting. No food, but yes, we still do have a guest speaker, and an amazing guest speaker at that. I'm very proud and very excited to introduce you to Israeli Consul General Dr. Hillel Newman, who's currently living in Los Angeles. Dr. Newman has been intimately involved in the most current and pressing issues on the global Jewish agenda, including the current flurry of peace deals in the region. He has a unique overview of the strategic threats facing Israel due to playing a key role in the strategic division of the foreign ministry. His diplomatic experience includes serving as a policy advisor to 3 foreign ministers. He is also a highly respected author, academic, and statesman. He made Aliyah to Israel from South Africa as a young man and has served as a medic in the IDF. Dr. Newman will be taking questions from everyone afterwards. So please use the chat at the bottom of your screen when he is done with his briefing. And then do remember to select Pamela, me, as the person you send your questions to, as I'm the moderator for the Q&A. Dr. Newman's topic for this evening is challenges and opportunities facing Israel today. And now, with no further ado, may I present to you Israeli Consul General Dr. Hillel Newman.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you so much. It is truly my pleasure to join you all this evening as a fellow South African and as a fellow now resident of the United States. It's really my pleasure, and thanks for the invitation. I'd like to, of course, mention Pamela as the president of SAJAC and Moira as the secretary and host. Thanks for inviting me, and it is really my pleasure to join you this evening. I'd like to open off with a greeting to all the South African expats. Hoe gaan dit? We hope you're all keeping well, and where perhaps we're opening up also a new chapter where the consulate is connected to the South Africans. I don't think it's ever happened before that there was a consul general who was from South Africa. So you have a special link, special protectia in the consulate. And let me open with saying also that, it's been a very challenging year. And I'll just tell you a little bit before we go into the details of the discussion about my background in South Africa and before I came here. I was born actually in Johannesburg. My father was a Rabbi Newman, and he established the Waverley Synagogue in Johannesburg. And then when I was 4 years old, we moved to Cape Town, and I grew up in Sea Point. My father was the rabbi of the Green and Hebrew Sea Point congregation. Served there for many years, and then we immigrated to Israel. I was still a teenager at the time, I think only 12 years old, really. And I grew up following the immigration to Israel, the Aliyah in Israel. It was, of course, a very big break in my life to move from South Africa to Israel. And I remember myself crying on the plane, but I think that it changed my life forever, and there's no doubt about that. And here I am sitting now as the representative of the State of Israel in the United States, in the third most important mission in the United States. And I feel very proud. I feel very proud of representing Israel. And I feel also very proud of the fact that Israel proves, just like the United States of America, that it's a country of opportunity and that everybody can make it. We have so many waves of immigration. We have Ethiopians and Russians and the previous immigrations of North Africa and East Europe. And it's all a big, I wouldn't say melting pot, because the idea in Israel is not that everyone melts and becomes one. It's one inclusive society in Israel. And there are blending of cultures and cuisines, and it's really amazing. It's amazing to see how it all comes together in this miraculous state of Israel. But I'll never forget my South African roots, and I feel very close to them. And luckily, my parents continued speaking English at home, so I grew up with English as my native language. Although I left at a very young age and went into the Hebrew-speaking environment. Anyway, we'll be able to speak about that later if anybody wants to ask questions, of course. The topic that I was asked to speak about are challenges and opportunities facing Israel in these times. So I will try and keep my words also not too extensive, but brief, so that we'll also have time for questions and answers. But let me give you a rundown what I see are the topics that fall into this category of challenges and opportunities. One of them is, of course, the COVID and the economy, which is a big challenge, but it is also an opportunity. And I think you'll hear during my words why every topic is actually also an opportunity. The second issue is the political situation in Israel, which is going through a transition process. We're going for elections. The third issue is the normalization of relations with the Arab world, which I think is a tremendous, dramatic shift. Fourth issue, which we should mention as challenges, are the threats facing Israel, which still exist. And the last issue, or perhaps to relate to, is the bipartisan relations with the United States, which is a challenge and an opportunity. Let's start off with COVID-19 and the economy. Israel was affected by, like the entire global scene, because of COVID. Our economy dropped, inflation went up, unemployment grew from 4% to 20%. We suffered like everybody else. We were actually the first one of the first countries in the world to impose restrictions on movement. We imposed restrictions on movement already at the end of January, the beginning of February. If you go back in time, there were very few countries that initiated any kind of restrictions at that time. And we did, because the leadership of Israel recognized the severity of the pandemic and immediately enforced restrictions on movement. And perhaps for that reason, we were also one of the first countries to implement an exit strategy. So we were one of the pioneer countries in the world to start implementing the exit strategy of opening up the markets and opening up travel. Unfortunately, we've had a second wave and a third wave, and we had to impose restrictions again, but it's all a matter of trial and error. And Israel, I think, has found the more or less the weight and balance that is needed. But the amazing achievement of Israel is the fact that we are the leading factor in the world in vaccinations. We have already vaccinated more than 25% of the population. And the belief is that by the end of March, the entire population of Israel will be vaccinated. If you compare that to other countries, including the United States, you will see that this is a tremendous achievement. And this achievement will also enable the state of Israel to be one of the first countries to open their markets and open the working place and the working environment, which means that we'll be getting out of the coronavirus earlier than others. So we're hopeful that the entire world will move forward very quickly. but it will give us that head start, which is an amazing achievement. Even the countries that manufacture Moderna and Pfizer have not got the same amount of vaccinations that Israel has managed to distribute. And the amazing thing about Israel is also that we were the only country in the world to establish a national unity government in order to deal with COVID-19. It's like the Democrats and Republicans coming together in order to form an emergency government. Can you imagine that in the atmosphere of the United States? Very hard to imagine. Well, it was hard to imagine also in Israel with the deep animosity between the camps, especially the anti-Netanyahu camp. But they did come together and they made a national unity government, which held for 8-9 months. But unfortunately, now it has fallen apart. There's some who say that it's for the better that it's fallen apart. But as we see ourselves coming out of COVID-19, it's also, I suppose, natural that the national unity government will also dismantle itself and will go to elections. What I'd say about the elections is that it's a tremendous display of the strength of democracy of Israel. That's the first thing to note. You know, there's some who scoff and they say, well, this is the 4th election campaign in 2 years in Israel. That's true. There's a lot of background and context to it. But we're the only country in the Middle East where there are open and free elections. And that Netanyahu doesn't know whether he'll be prime minister because it depends on the vote, depends on the popular vote. There are no special conditions and benefits for the prime minister. The prime minister can be, we have the judicial power and we have the executive power and we have the parliamentary power, and they're all split and they're all powerful. We're really an exemplar of democracy in the world. Not mentioning the fact that we're the one and only democracy in the Middle East. It's much more difficult to be a democracy when you're in a jungle than when you're situated in Switzerland, let's say. But anyway, the strength of democracy has led us to a 4th election campaign. The elections will be on the 20th of March. And what I would say, I'm sure you're all well versed in what's going on in Israel. I won't go into the details of the parties. You can all read that up. I'll just try and give a few perhaps insights to what the significant factors of the election are. The first thing I would say is that the most interesting fact about the elections this time is that it's not about foreign policy. In fact, it's not about left or right. It's all about leadership. It's all just about the main axis of the election is, are you pro-Netanyahu or are you challenging the leadership of Netanyahu? And you find strong rightists like Gideon Sa'ar who are running against Netanyahu. They come from the Likud party and they don't have any difference in policy between themselves and Netanyahu, but they're running against Netanyahu and they'll say they'll not sit with Netanyahu. So there's a very powerful axis, which is the challenging of leadership of Netanyahu. And that's one of the strongest glues. And that brings together a whole mix of parties, like you have Gideon Sa'ar, as I said, and Yair Lapid, who used to be the leader of the opposition, and you have Lieberman, who used to also be the chief of staff of Netanyahu, and is now running on the same ticket as not sitting with Netanyahu. And you have also, of course, the leftist parties like Meretz and others. So there's a whole bloc out there which is against Netanyahu, challenging the leadership of Netanyahu. And then you have the other bloc, which is those that are on the right and prepared to sit with Netanyahu, and the religious parties. So you really have the blocks have changed. It's no longer a block of, are you in favor of more territorial concessions for peace? That's not the block anymore. The block is not left and right. It's not foreign policy. There's hardly any difference between the large competing parties on these issues. So it's all around domestic issues. Another axis of the elections is religion and state, or church and state, as you might call it. And that's a big issue because some of the parties are going against sitting with the religious parties or the ultra-religious parties. So it makes any coalition building in the future very complicated because it's no longer right and left, a block of the left, a block of the right. You have intersecting axes here of who is, okay, you might be right, but you're still against Netanyahu. You might be left, but you're still prepared to sit with Netanyahu. It's a whole mix-up. You have part of the Arab Party that is now saying that they're prepared to sit with Netanyahu. So you've really got a complex situation. If I had to bet now, I would say that there are strong chances that neither of the blocs will have a 61 coalition to make a government, and they might have to go to elections again. But there is a probability, not high at the moment, but it can change. The polls are fluctuating, and it depends on the previous issue which we discussed, which is COVID-19. If COVID-19 goes very quickly and the vaccinations are given out and the market goes back to normal, there might be a swerve towards Netanyahu, which will give him the majority together with the religious parties. His coalition is actually a makeup of the Likud party together with Bennett, together with the religious parties. If they get a 61 margin, they can make a government. The other option is that if things do not improve and things remain stagnated, and the opposing bloc to Netanyahu gets 61. But it's a bit more complicated because some are not prepared to sit with the other, and we have the far left with the far right. So the question is, can really Gideon Sa'ar, who comes from the Likud, sit with Meretz, which is the far left in Israel, or with the Arab Party? If they're not prepared to sit with Meretz and the Arab Party, there's no government on the other side of the bloc. So it's going to be very interesting. Let's move on. Let's talk about the normalization of relations. You know, if I had to think of any other big, dramatic, significant development in the recent times, I would say it's normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab world. In the past 2 months, we've seen a normalizing of relations with UAE, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, Kingdom of Bhutan, countries that in the past boycotted Israel. In fact, UAE, in order to establish peace with Israel, they had to cancel their boycott of Israel. They first had to cancel their official boycott of Israel in their own parliament before they could move and make peace with Israel. What is most significant is that Sudan joined. We should all remember that Khartoum is the capital of Sudan, where in 1967 the entire Arab League adopted the resolution of 3 no's: no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel, no talks with Israel. And here in Khartoum, Sudan, they're one of the first countries to jump forward and make peace with Israel. So we're ushering in truly a new era in the Middle East. If I had to give a few insights again on this issue of what is the significance. I mean, some people say, well, Israel already has peace with Egypt and Jordan. But I would contend that the peace that is being established now is tremendously significant. And I'll give a few reasons. First of all, it's a breaking of the ideological taboo against Israel. It's a breaking up of the Arab League resolution entirely. With Egypt and Jordan, there was always the thought that it's actually like an armistice. It's like a stop, preventing war. It's not real peace. And there never was a warm peace between Israel and Egypt and Jordan. It never went down to the grassroots level. But in this peace that we're forging now, it's going to be a very warm peace. It's amazing. If you just follow the social media in UAE and Bahrain, and you follow the agreements that have been signed already in the last 2 months, and the amount of tourists that have visited from Israel, thousands of tourists, more than 20,000 Israelis have already visited UAE in the past 2 months. We're talking about an opening up of markets, an opening up of cultures. It's amazing. If I just give one, perhaps, a demonstration of this, I would mention the fact that, there's an Israeli singer called Omer Adam. And Omer Adam was photographed together with an Egyptian singer. And when this Egyptian singer returned to Egypt, he received a tremendous backlash from the Egyptians. And on the TV, they demanded that he explain how it happened that he had a photograph with an Israeli. And he had to try and get out of this. And he started saying he didn't know who was in the photograph when the photograph was taken. Well, that same Omer Adam, the photograph was taken, first of all, in UAE. It was taken when Omer Adam was invited to give official performances in the palace of the Sheikh. And he gave public performances in UAE. And it was all published in the public media and the social media of prominent people in UAE. So here you have a very vibrant demonstration of the difference in the culture that is being developed and the type of peace that is emerging. The second thing that is very significant in the peace and the normalization is the fact that it's revealing that the core issue of conflict in the Middle East is not the Palestinian issue, it's not water, it's not territories, but it's the recognition of Israel. Any country that comes forward and recognizes Israel receives peace, and immediately peace is established. The bone of conflict in the Middle East has always been the rejection of Israel, and that goes true for the Palestinians as well. Israel has said this for years. Israel, even when it was established, and even before it was re-established in 1948, extended a hand of friendship and peace to the entire Muslim and Arab world. Unfortunately, they rejected Israel's extended hand for peace, and they chose the path of rejection and war. And slowly, with time, we see now that they're coming to terms with the existence of Israel, and every country that comes forward will receive peace. A third aspect which is very important to note is the realignment of forces in the Middle East. We see here an alignment of a large bloc, which we would call the moderate bloc, against the radicals. And within the radicals, we have, of course, Iran as a radical regime, which is the #1 state supporter of terrorism, which instigates unrest in the entire Middle East, including in the Persian Gulf. And these countries are aware of the threat that is posed to them from Iran. But it's not only Iran, it's also jihad, terrorists, proxy groups, militias, the Muslim Brotherhood, all kinds of radical organizations that are out there in order to topple the regime. And they have at last understood that Israel is an ally and not an enemy. And Israel can be a very strong ally for them. Another aspect which is important to note is that they didn't make peace just because of Iran. They made peace because they know that they can get tremendous benefits from Israel. And that's the image of Israel that has become a powerhouse of innovation. And this is, if I return back to COVID-19 and the economy, the opportunity that has come out of COVID-19 is the fact that COVID-19 has accelerated the trend of moving towards innovation and ingenuity and artificial intelligence. And Israel is a superpower. We call Israel is called a startup nation, but it's a superpower, a pioneer in many of the modern technology aspects. And we're on the top of the wave of this tendency. We're leading many innovations in all types of applied sciences and applied technology. And therefore, this development is also going to spring Israel's economy forward. But it's also emphasizing the fact that Israel is of great benefit. And these countries like UAE and Bahrain, it's true they've enjoyed a very strong economy, but it was based on natural resources. And they know that natural resources will one day diminish. And they have to transform the economies to productive economies, innovative economies. And they know that they can learn that from Israel. Last thing I would mention about the significance of the peace is that what was proven in this peace is that a strong US-Israel alliance brings peace. You know, there were opinions in the past that even by presidential leaders of the United States, that you have to show that you're not so much a friend of Israel in order to bring peace. What we call daylight, have daylight between Israel and the United States, in order to prove that the United States is an honest broker. Well, the events of the past few months and over the past year and two show that a strong US-Israel alliance brings the countries to make peace. If they see that Israel is a strong friend of the United States, and the United States is a strong ally of Israel, and then we back up each other, and we're prepared to support each other, and it's an unbreakable link and tie, then those countries will want the closeness of Israel and the United States. So that's a strong lesson to be learned from this. Let's move on to the challenge that we have, the threats that still remain. Not everything is rosy in the Middle East with all the positive developments that I mentioned, the peace and the recognition of the importance of Israel. Of course, there are enemies out there. And Iran is the #1 octopus, which has many tentacles, supporting the Hezbollah, which threatens Israel from the north, supporting the Hamas, which threatens Israel from the south, trying to establish itself militarily in Syria, and trying, of course, to develop a nuclear warhead and support terrorism around the world. You should know that Iran tries to hit out at Jewish and Israeli targets all the time around the globe. It's not something that happened many years ago and has ceased. This is an ongoing threat. And there, of course, there are proxy groups and militias and jihad groups which are out there bent on the destruction and annihilation of the state of Israel. So, unfortunately, we have enemies, but a strong Israel means that we can stand and we can prevail over our enemies. And that brings us again back to the issue of the expanding, enhancing the circle of peace, the strengthening of the economy through innovation and ingenuity. It's all interconnected. All these issues have an interconnection, and the strong Israel-American alliance. Let me move on to the bipartisan relationship. We've had big developments recently with the Biden administration coming in, the elections. We've seen also the unfortunate incidents, also a rise in anti-Semitism in the United States, which is worrying and an issue of concern, which we can talk about in the questions and answers if you want to. What is of utmost importance to Israel is the strong bipartisan relationship between Israel and the United States. The relations were never between two individuals or two parties. The relations were always between two countries that base their relationship on values, deep-seated values, which go from the Judeo-Christian heritage through the values of democracy and to the values of today of human rights. Israel is the number one ally of the United States around the world. If the United States needs any kind of ally, Israel is there. When the United States needed airspace of Egypt, although they gave tremendous amounts of aid to Egypt, Egypt refused. Israel will never refuse a wish or a concern of the United States. And the same goes the opposite, that for Israel, the United States is its strongest and closest friend and ally. And this is the relationship where we must do our best and our ultimate to preserve. There are, unfortunately, extreme elements, both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. In the Democratic Party, you've got like the Squad, and you've got elements that support BDS, which we regard as anti-Semitism. And you've got elements also, extreme elements also in the Republican Party, whether it's the white supremacists, and even in the riots, whether they come from the left or the right, they shout out against Jews and Israel. So there's a strong element of anti-Semitism in all parties. And this is also connecting to our relationship. Our relationship, though, between Israel and the United States is between the mainstream, old school, those that believe in this relationship and believe in the benefit of this relationship for both countries. Biden is a good friend of Israel. He is also, if I just mention recent things, then he, of course, was the one that made a decision that the Democratic platform would not include a conditioning of support to Israel on all kinds of political things. Although there was a call within the Democratic Party to do so, he refused to do that. He also, you should know that there was a call within the Democratic Party to condition. It's actually a conditioning of the relations between Israel and the United States. So by him coming forward and not supporting that, it was a very significant aspect. Also, he refused to include the word occupation in the platform of the Democratic Party. So Biden, he has a strong record. We know he's a good friend of Israel, and we just hope it will continue. Of course, there are issues where we may have differences of opinion, like the issue of Iran, the issue of how to promote peace in the region, how to promote peace with the Palestinians. We might have differences of opinion. We will try our utmost to try and coordinate our policies as much as possible. I can only tell you that as a very senior official of Israel visited the United States recently and had very senior meetings in order to try and coordinate policy. So we know that the differences of opinion may be on policy, but not on the big picture, not on the objectives, and not on the close relationship and the alliance between our two countries. I think I've related to all the big issues that are on our table. I think we should open it up for questions to give an opportunity to everyone to speak. And I'd also like to mention that I was extremely pleased to hear that I'm an honorary member or a member of SAJAC, and it's my pleasure to be a member. And I think that also friends from Los Angeles have joined because we spread the news about this briefing. So this is also an opportunity for all South Africans to try and get together. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Newman. Boy, the people are quick to talk to me. The first question that came up was, can Netanyahu overcome his legal issues?
Okay, thank you for the question. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not his attorney or his litigator, but I can give you the viewpoint from as an Israeli and as a spectator of the events as they've been taking place. And what I would stress is that, you know, Israel as a strong democracy has a very strong principle, which is the presumption of innocence. The fact that you give an indictment against someone does not mean that he's guilty. Oy vavoy, if we reach a situation where just the giving forth of an indictment makes that person guilty. Because what it means is that one clerk in the prosecutor's office can topple the prime minister who's elected by 2.5 million people. That's an impossible situation. And the people of Israel reject that. They reject the overpowering of the judicial branch of government over the parliamentary and the executive branch. We must always preserve that balance between the three central powers of government. And if you give too much power to one over the other, then you're actually jeopardizing the democracy of the state. So if you give too much power to the judicial process to topple a prime minister, even though he has not been found guilty, then you're actually dismantling elections by millions of people by one or two individuals, which is an impossible situation. So we must work with the presumption of innocence. For him to be guilty, he has to go through a court case and he has to be found guilty. Until that time, he's regarded as innocent. Regarding the charges themselves, as I said, I'm not an attorney. I'm not on his team or against him. I'm just an observer, and I just say that, look, a few charges have been brought against him. There's a lot of dispute in Israel about the charges, whether they are legitimate, they are not. There's a strong voice in Israel, which is also represented in the strong bloc, which challenges the leadership of Netanyahu, which says that just the fact that you've got accusations like this, you should actually resign and you should actually change the political situation. But we should remember that we've been to 3 elections, and in all 3 elections, the public of Israel did not give the majority to the anti-Bibi camp. They did not. Gantz ran on that ticket of being anti-Bibi and that Bibi should resign, and he did not get the necessary majority in order to make a coalition. So there's a strong proportion of Israel that believes in the presumption of innocence and that we should go through the proceedings before anything is changed because of the judicial process.
Thank you. Okay, here's the next question. I'll give you, both of them have to do with Biden. Several members of Biden's team are Jewish. Is this viewed as positive by Israel? And the other question is the pros and cons of the Iran deal, and should Biden re-enter them?
Sure. Regarding Jewish or not Jewish, look, we don't judge people according to whether they're Jewish or not Jewish. It plays both ways. Sometimes you have Jews that when they get into a senior position, then they want to try and prove that they're not biased towards Israel, and therefore they go against Israel. And then you have Jews that, because of their natural affinity to Israel, that they are more balanced and they even give a preference to Israel. So it goes either way. I wouldn't say that you should judge a person just by or presume something about a person just because they are Jewish or not Jewish. We will see according to the policies and according to the opinions that are voiced. We know a lot of the team. A lot of them were members of the Obama team, and we know them from them as well. With some of them, we've had a very good relationship with over the years, and we've maintained a good relationship. But it's a matter of opinions and policy. And we do hope that whether they're Jewish or not Jewish, that their policies are aligned with the policies of Israel, because we believe that our policies are the correct ones, and they are the ones that will lead to peace and stability in the Middle East. So, of course, we prefer that everyone agrees with our policies and doesn't propose alternative policies which we think are worse. Regarding Iran, Iran, of course, is a big issue, and that may be a policy issue where we might have divisions or divides between us and the upcoming administration. Our belief is, I think we all agree, both Israel, the United States, the Biden administration, everyone agrees that the objective is to prevent Iran from having nuclear military capability. That everyone agrees. Now, so the objective is agreed upon, the consensus. The question or the difference of opinion is on the tactics or the strategy of how to reach there. Now, President Obama went on the path of the JCPOA, which was the nuclear agreement. And Israel, from the beginning, said that we thought it was a mistaken policy. We didn't have anything against Obama or the Democrats, or it was against the policy. And we said from the moment it started, we mentioned and we stated that we think that JCPOA is a mistake, because instead of preventing Iran from having nuclear capability, it paved the way for Iran to have nuclear capability, because the agreement set deadlines, what are called the sunset clauses, which meant that after a specific amount of time, Iran would then have full legitimacy to go forward with a nuclear military capability and program. So if you're actually paving the way for them to enrich and to have the capability in the future. So you're just postponing the problem and giving legitimacy to Iran. That was why we were against, we thought it was a mistaken policy. Besides that, the JCPOA did not address big issues, the big elephants in the room, which were the fact that Iran supports terrorism worldwide, the fact that Iran calls for the annihilation of the State of Israel, the fact that Iran instills unrest in the entire Middle East, trying to topple moderate regimes, the fact that Iran is developing missile capability and threatening to use these missiles against the United States, Israel, the West, and then supplying these missiles to proxy militia groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. So there are a lot of issues with Iran. Iran is not just the nuclear issue. But if to answer the question, our belief is that we can go back to negotiations with Iran. But we should remember that the extreme pressure on Iran is the only thing that will actually bring Iran to make compromises and dismantle their nuclear ambitions. So we must maintain the pressure, and we must understand that we cannot go back to the JCPOA as it was. We must, if we're looking for a new agreement, we must change the agreement, fix the JCPOA to make it address all the issues that need addressing.
Thank you. Okay, next. Regarding normalization, please comment on the so-called Million Man March in Pakistan against normalization with Israel.
Yeah, unfortunately, not everyone agrees with normalization, and it's a slow process. You know, this is a process which has been going on for a decade and a half. It took UAE and Bahrain a decade and a half of a slow, gradual progress and process to come to terms with the existence of the State of Israel and normalize relations. So this is a long process. It began with the fact that all 22 Arab states in the Arab League refused to have any relations with Israel, refused to recognize Israel. And we moved forward, and then we established peace with Egypt and Jordan. And now we have peace again with additional states like UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, etc. So the vector is positive, but it takes time. There are still bent enemies out there, like Iran and like Malaysia and Pakistan or other countries where they have a strong nucleus of Israel haters, Jew haters, really. And it'll take a long time for them to change their ways, if at all. You know, all these countries have grown up on an indoctrination of hatred towards Israel and the Jews. And some of these countries want to have relations with Israel, but they're victims of their own indoctrination. I don't want to reveal names, but I myself played a part in the peace process with UAE. And I actually visited UAE in July of 2019, together with our foreign minister. And I can tell you that their concerns, UAE, were from their own Arab world, from the Arab street, and from the extremists, the radicals within the Arab world that might hit out at them because of the peace with Israel. And when you talk about the Arab street is a product of the indoctrination of decades of these Arab countries and Muslim countries teaching and preaching hatred of Israel and the Jews. And now they're a product and they're a victim of this. So it will take a long time for us to get out of this rut. And what we need is that these countries stop this hateful education material against Israel. Even the Palestinian Authority, which we have so-called relations with, they continue to preach hatred towards Israel, and they continue to distribute maps which do not have the State of Israel on them. So we have to change the entire educational process and the educational material for the Arab world. It will take a long time. But as I said, there are countries that are more extreme than others. Let me mention one more thing. I'll take a minute more of your time, and I'll just say that one of the biggest shocks to me when I went to serve as ambassador in Uzbekistan, which is a Muslim country, is that I found a Muslim country which was so friendly towards Israel. And that was a cultural shock to me, because I was so used to the Islam of the Middle East, which is indoctrinated, full of, spread with hatred towards Israel and the Jews. And it's politicized and indoctrinized against Israel. But there is another Islam out there, and that is the Islam that regards the Jews as the family, as one big family, what we call the Abrahamic family. They believe that they came from Ishmael and the Jews came from Yitzchak, Isaac, but we all come from Abraham. We're cousins. And there are a lot of Muslims out there that want this close relationship with the Jews. And that was my cultural shock in Uzbekistan. And it was also the same type of Islam exists in the moderate countries like UAE, Bahrain. They just have to get over the fear of the Arab street and their own indoctrination and move forward with the relations. But you will always have also this radicalized, politicized Islam, which exists a lot in places like Pakistan and Malaysia.
Thank you, Hillel. Just as an aside, there's somebody called Test, and can you please identify yourself so that we know who you are?
I think it's a test mode of the software.
Okay.
Maybe.
Now, do you know when Israel will allow non-Israelis to enter?
Yeah, that's a big issue, and of course we deal with it on a daily basis in our consulate. Consulate does many things. The main basis of our work is to try and build the bilateral relationship between Israel and the United States, which means meeting elected officials and networking on all levels and cultural events and talks like this. But all the Israelis think that we're there for them. And those that want a visa think that we're there for them. So it's true, we are there, but we have a very multi-tasked agenda. And one of our big issues on our agenda is taking care of non-Israeli citizens that wish to visit Israel. Now, in normal circumstances, any American can get on a plane and visit Israel. But because of COVID-19, there are tough restrictions, and non-Israelis are not allowed to come to Israel without written approval in advance. And the regulations change all the time. At the moment, we're in one of the most strictest periods of regulations and time, where only very specific exemptions are given for approval. The rest are not allowed to come to visit Israel. If you ask when will it change, I believe that once the majority of the population is vaccinated, which will most probably be by the end of March, things will start opening up. They'll then be able to open up the market. They'll be able also to be lenient on the restrictions of travel. And I believe that towards the end of March, April, we'll begin to see, maybe even before, but leading up to March, April, we'll begin to see an easing of the restrictions. I can't tell you now whether everyone will be able to be allowed to come freely. I think it will take time. The regulations will be removed slowly and gradually. But our belief is that by summer of this year, people will be able to travel freely to Israel.
No one talks about Turkey. Are they not a threat to Israel?
Turkey, Turkey is a lot of ups and downs with Turkey. And unfortunately, since the Erdogan came in, things took a bad turn in our relations. We always had very good historic relations with Turkey. We remember periods of time that there was a strong security alliance and strong security collaboration between Israel and Turkey. We regarded Israel as a strong friend and ally, and we hope that the day will return. It's a matter of policies. It's a matter of issues that need to be solved. I believe that we're actually on track.
What is Israel doing to balance the various peripheral communities, the Arabs, Israelis, Haredi, Bedouins, Ethiopians, to be on a par with the Israelis?
Israel, of course, has this issue of minority groups that claim that they want more in the budgets and more in the allocations. And it's not for me to judge whether they do get their exact proportional amount in budgets or not. What I can tell you is that as we move on in time, things are getting better, both in the Haredi sector and also in the Arab community sector. The government of Israel set forth a 5-year plan to take care of the Arab community, which meant a lot of allocations of budgets. The plan began, was implemented partly, and then, of course, COVID-19 hit in, and the whole budget and the whole treasury situation has changed. But actually, under Netanyahu, there was this plan of a multi-year plan to improve facilities and infrastructure within the Arab communities in Israel. It should be said and noted and emphasized that the Arab communities in Israel, I'm talking about the Arab communities that belong to the state of Israel, not the Palestinians who have chosen not to, but those that live within Israel and carry Israeli citizenship. They have full equal rights. They can vote for the parliament. They're voted in for the parliament. The third largest party in the parliament was the Arab Party. So they serve in just about every single field you can think of, the judiciary, even the IDF, those that want to. So there's a full open society in Israel for them. Those who cry that there's a lack of equality, it's an incorrect statement. When you talk about allocations of budgets, of course, every community complains. Many Jewish communities complain that they are forfeited or that they don't receive the exact amount that they should. Every community wants to receive more. That's obvious. What I can tell you is also that there are changes taking place within the Arab community, where we see that, for instance, now all of a sudden the parts of the Arab Party, as I mentioned at the beginning of my words, are thinking about aligning themselves with Netanyahu because of the fact that Netanyahu has come forth with this program of improving the civil situation of the Arab community. Another aspect, the Haredim, the ultra-religious, there's a slow process, but it's moving forward. And there's a process of, first of all, including more and more ultra-religious in IDF service, and also in their release to the market, the economy at a younger age. This is a process which has been taking place over a few years. Many committees were set up in order to do this. And the good news is that more and more Haredim, ultra-religious, are choosing to take an active part in the society, whether it be in going into IDF service or going at an earlier age into the market, into the economy of Israel. So there are positive trends in the Israeli society in both aspects.
Thank you. Is there a good relationship between Israel and South Africa?
We would hope for one. You know, as my motherland, of course, there's nothing I'd like more than to have excellent relations with South Africa. Unfortunately, not everything is perfect with South Africa. And South Africa has chosen a path over the past few years of cooling its relations with Israel. We are hopeful that the day will come that South Africa, like many other African countries, will understand that they're following a mistaken policy. Israel has expanded its relations in Africa dramatically. Sudan is just a good example of the fact that here you see Sudan come forward and establish diplomatic relations with Israel. It's because they know the benefits that they can get from Israel, and they know the good work that Israel is doing in Africa. We have excellent relations with Ethiopia and other. We're building relations dramatically in Africa. South Africa, due to the historical developments with the Palestinians and due to the relations in the past, have chosen to lower the profile rates, let's say, within our relations. And we are hoping that they will upgrade the relations. It's up to them to make that decision.
What is the best case and the worst case scenario for Israel for the outcome of the situation in Syria?
The worst case scenario is that Iran continues its efforts to entrench its military forces in Syria. That's a worst case scenario because it leads us to direct confrontation, military confrontation with Iran. We have confrontation with Iran, but it's usually via proxy groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and terrorist organizations, terrorists around the world. But they're all proxy groups. They're all proxy hidden identities, hiding behind Iran, really, or Iran hiding behind them, really. But with the militias, with the Revolutionary Guard that is establishing itself in Syria, this is a direct confrontation of Iranians and Israel. And Israel warned from the very beginning, when Syria was going into the civil war and foreign powers started offering assistance to Syria like Russia and Iran, we warned against an infiltration of Iran and a building of infrastructure, of Iranian infrastructure in Syria. We knew that Iran is not there on a temporary basis. Iran, if it establishes itself there, it will try and remain there forever, and they will build another foothold to attack Israel and the West. They're on a campaign of expanding their malign influence and their revolutionary approach, Islamic revolutionary approach, around wherever they can. And they've already expanded their influence all the way from Tehran to the Mediterranean, to Damascus, to Beirut. So we must try and block the spread of their revolutionary radical ideas and their activity, which is so problematic. And Syria is one of the biggest problems now because Iran is trying to establish itself militarily in Syria, and Israel has stated categorically that we will not allow a permanent military foothold of Iran in Syria. So that leads to direct confrontation.
Has Israel got a good relationship with China?
Yes, China is a lot in the news. We know the issues, and it's a very sensitive issue. Israel does have good relations with China, but Israel at the same time has set up a committee which monitors Chinese investments. So Israel has come on board on the American expectations that we should monitor Chinese investments and Chinese infiltration into different countries. So we have such a committee. The committee monitors and supervises Chinese investments like many other countries in Israel. And we want to move forward in our relations with China, but we also are very sensitive to the needs and the concerns of the United States and the Western world in this aspect of Chinese infrastructure.
So now with COVID, what have you been able to do as the Consul General living in Los Angeles?
Well, our activity changed completely. Before COVID-19, our main activity is what we call public diplomacy, which is gala events, speaking at gala evening events, fundraisers, meeting people in person, important people and less important people across the board, across all spectrums. trying to bring about that human touch, and all of a sudden that human touch is severed. So it's a problem, and we have changed our activity in many ways. I'll give a few examples of what we did do during COVID-19. For instance, we first of all, we put up solidarity billboards on the I-10 expressing solidarity with the first responders and the people of California in order to express our solidarity and bring positive associations to Israel. Other things we did a lot of humanitarian projects, like, for instance, giving computers to African-American children at school, that they all of a sudden they couldn't go to school anymore and they needed to connect through electronic systems, and they didn't have computers, they didn't have iPads, and we got calls from religious African-American leaders who asked us for our help, and we decided to help. So we gave out computers to African-American kids, we gave out computers and headphones to Latinos, even to veterans, Latino veterans who came out of the military and they had no vocational training, and so we connected with them as well. We were instrumental and partners in setting up testing sites in East LA for Latino communities that could not even did not have the means to go to the testing sites to get tested. We also gave food packages to different communities that were in need, churches, communities, and even Holocaust survivors. We gave out packages of food to Holocaust survivors in different areas, just a gift from the Israeli consulate. So we've tried to show also that we care and express our solidarity. Besides that, there have been interesting developments like scientific collaboration, high-tech collaboration. There were also procurements that we did from California of items that Israel needed and they manufactured in California. That has stopped because now Israel self-produces everything. We've developed the technology that was needed. But at the beginning stages, we needed to purchase abroad, and we purchased from here. There's a lot of cooperation going on between Israel and California in innovation and desalination and other aspects. And I think that COVID-19 will lead on to other aspects of cooperation. So I would say that COVID-19 has changed our work in many ways. We've also changed from in-person briefings to Zoom briefings to meetings of people through Zoom. We've done a lot of cultural activity and academic activity through Zoom. And this is just a place for me to mention that all those who want to be to receive our updates on activity and things going on in Israel and cultural events are invited to link up with our distribution of emails about things that are going on. So a lot has been going on, and we've been changing our activity and modifying it according to the needs.
That's fantastic. You have been such a wealth of knowledge, Dr. Newman. Really appreciate it. Here's the last question. Peace with Palestinians, is it viable?
Oh, I love an easy question before the end. Yeah, let's just make peace now, and we'll settle it and bring world peace. It is viable, of course it is, but it's not the mistaken aspect in common media outlets is that as if it's up to Israel, and that's totally false. It's up to the Palestinians. As I said before, the core issue of conflict in the Middle East has been the rejection of Israel, and the same goes for the Palestinians. If the Palestinians were prepared to make the concessions they need to make, we would have had peace long time ago. They have to recognize that Israel is the homeland for the Jewish people, and it's to remain. It's very difficult for them to accept that, and I'll give you proof. First of all, there is a split between the Fatah and the Hamas, where the Hamas negates any existence of Israel in any borders. It's not a matter, they don't accept the peace accords that have been signed between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. They reject any inch of Israel in any border. And they now control the Gaza Strip and threaten Abu Mazen's rule even in the West Bank. So that's the Palestinian camp. So can you call the Palestinians partners to peace? It's a question. And the second aspect that is proof is that many deals have been placed on the table. There have been 3 or 4 options of viable peace placed on the table, whether it was Clinton during President Clinton's time with Prime Minister Olmert, and they aspired to coming to a peace, a complete resolution of the conflict with the Palestinians, and they placed a deal on the table. And in each time that deals have been placed on the table, and it's happened already at least 3 times, the Palestinians have rejected the deal without any counter proposal. Now, if you're interested in a deal, then the least you do is you say, okay, I would like to accept it, but I'd like X, Y, Z to be changed. But the Palestinians have rejected without any counter proposal. So it's not a problem of Israel not willing to propose peace. The problem is the Palestinian side willing to propose and accept a peace. This has been the problem throughout. For the past decade or so, Netanyahu has called upon Abu Mazen to meet anytime, any place to continue the direct negotiations for peace. He said he's prepared to come to Ramallah. Abu Mazen, we're still waiting for his answer. He hasn't replied. What Abu Mazen has chosen to do is go to the UN and multilateral organizations to pressure Israel in order to try and get more concessions from Israel from the multilateral arena. And that, of course, is not leading any closer to peace. The way to peace is to have direct negotiations. The problem, if you analyze it, the problem is that Abu Mazen is too weak to make the compromises that are necessary for peace. And there are compromises that have to be made on the Palestinian side. We cannot make peace with the Palestinians and then accept millions of Palestinians to the state of Israel, and not even the state of Palestine. So when they talk about a two-state solution, they're talking about establishing a Palestinian state and then initiating a law of return of all the Palestinians to the state of Israel. Why are they demanding that? Because they want to annihilate the state of Israel. That's a different way of saying we want one state of Palestine. So there are some compromises that they have to accept. There's a reality in the Middle East, and Abu Mazen at this moment is just too weak to make the compromises. I think that he's afraid also of the Hamas and radical elements in the Islamic camp. He doesn't have control of the Gaza Strip. That's just a sign of the weakness they're suffering in the Palestinian side. Since the Oslo agreements, no one can say that Israel does not recognize the Palestinians. We do. We recognize the Palestinians as a nation. As a nation, we've offered two-state solution a few times on the table. The question remains whether the Palestinians are prepared to accept Israel and prepared to accept a Jewish state of Israel in the Middle East. When they do, there will be peace. Now, I'm optimistic because I think that the fact that we normalize relations with the Arab world is actually maybe a trigger to bring the Palestinians to the table. Because up to now, they felt the time was on their side. They felt that the pressure was on Israel. And now they understand that the longer they reject any peace proposal, they're actually losing. They're losing ground. Countries like UAE and Bahrain are already fatigued from the Palestinian rejectionism. So they're losing ground in the Arab world itself. So if they understand the time is not on their side, and they understand the benefits that they can get, they choose to live in peace with Israel, there will be peace.
Thank you very much. This has been so enlightening. And I'm going to read the chat from Leah, who says, again, our appreciation for connecting us with Dr. Newman, who has given an incredible account of the state of Israeli politics. Thank you. So now that you're on our email list because you are a SAJAC member, you'll be hearing from us occasionally. So don't be a stranger. And how long is your time in Los Angeles?
My period of time is 4 years, and I've been here 1 year and a few months, so you're still stuck with me.
Oh, good. Well, maybe post-COVID, we can do something else where we invite you to actually come to San Diego.
It'll be my pleasure, and biltong will be expected.